Welcome back. A group of 7 opposition political parties have joined forces to hold what they will call a national convention to discuss working together in the national and provincial elections next year. The parties include the DA, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, the National Freedom Party, the United Independent Movement and the Spectrum National Party. You may remember the DA leader John Steenhuisen saying earlier this year he wanted to launch what he then called a moonshot pact to unite most of the opposition parties against the ANC and the EFF. Michael Beaumont is the National Chair of Action SA. Michael, good afternoon. Thanks for coming in.
It's good to be with you in studio.
What's a national convention?
Well, it's getting these parties around a table and it's saying that there are many things we will have to agree to disagree about. And while we may contest as individual parties in an election next year, we need to show the South African people that we can be coherent. And we can be coherent about the most pressing challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis in such a way that we can win a majority in 2024 and then we can govern and produce some kind of stable, effective government thereafter.
So would this national convention, if you were to keep the ANC and the EFF out of power, be the basis of a new government? Would it be a coalition?
It's going to lead to a coalition. So essentially, you'll form a pact before a local government election that will become the basis of a coalition to follow. But you touch on a really important point, and that is that it's an Action SA view. We need the broadest possible church of political parties that we can put under one roof together if we are going to achieve that majority. This can't be a country club. It can't be exclusive. And we're going to have to agree to disagree on certain things. But there are so many spaces in the policy environment where we can find common ground on how to address the greatest challenges South Africans are living with.
Many of the parties have worked together in the past. So you, as Action SA, the DA, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, all of you have worked together for quite a long time in some cases, some before Action SA was formed. But that must help in forming something like this.
It does, and I think, let's be real, that the local government coalition experience hasn't been a good one, and no one wants to see that kind of instability being imported into the running of national government. And I think a lot of lessons have been learnt in that regard, but also we're going into these talks with those scars fully, but at the same time appreciating it can't poison the national conversation. The fact that things haven't worked out well at a local government coalition level here in Gauteng can't mean that we're going to give up the fight in 2024. We've got to come together. We've got to build trust along the way as we work to build that alternative.
I was slightly surprised to see the ACDP, I think, will attend this event as an observer, but hasn't decided to join at this stage. And yet, they've probably worked with the DA and the IFP the longest.
Yeah, I think there are a few parties who are attending the pre-talks as observers, and I think they're still open to attending the convention as a full participant. But I think certainly it's a challenging environment. The way this thing was announced at an elective conference of one of the parties wasn't a very good way of bringing parties on board. And at the same time, I think there are parties that are very cautious to see that they don't want their individual identity to be eroded in this process. But I think we are talking to those parties, and there are a number that are joining as we're speaking right now, and I'm very, very sure that that list of 7 is going to be a lot larger by the time we get to August.
There are 1 or 2 parties that I think very few people have heard of. I had not heard of the Spectrum National Party, for example. What's it been like working with them? Well,
you and me both. But, you know, the reality is the South African space involves a lot of new political parties entering that environment. And certainly Action SA is an organisation that is not represented in Parliament ourselves. So the point, I think, is with the major and established parties often in decline, you know, emerging political parties are a growing space in South Africa. And I think, you know, Spectrum National Party aside, there are other organisations as well. You think about BOSA and you think about Razum Zanzi. I think these are organisations that have something to contribute, and certainly we should be talking to them going forward as well.
You make the point that there are a lot of policy things on which you agree, and the overall one is let's keep the ANC and the EFF out. That's what you say. That's fine. Apart from that, what else do you agree on? I mean, the IFP and the Freedom Front Plus tend to attract people of particular ethnic or language identities. Tend to. Action SA and the DA tend to attract a much more diverse group of voters, often based in urban areas. Is there really that much in common once you get into government? I mean, I can see the argument starting.
Well, certainly, and I think, let me say from the outset, Action SA is attracting voters in rural and urban environments at the same time. But beyond that, to make this apparent, is that these talks have taken a very interesting angle in the last few weeks. So in the last few weeks, we've very deliberately gone through a process of looking at the policy overlap as it relates to the most important challenges facing South Africans. So growing the economy, ending load shedding, fighting crime and corruption, overhauling our education system, etc. And what we're finding is there is overlap. In fact, a lot of the things that have caused political parties to butt heads in the past have not been around the policy space. It's been around personalities, it's been around implementation. And this policy process we've gone through nationally has shown there's a hell of a lot of common ground amongst political parties in South Africa that we can forge in this process. A
lot of strong personalities. I mean, Herman Mashaba, I think you'll agree with me, is a strong personality. John Steenhuisen, Prince Mangosuthu, Velenkosini Klabisa. I mean, these are strong personalities. Are they all going to be in a room together?
Absolutely. This process must be led by the leaders of parties. There will be delegations from each party, but ultimately it's the leaders who are going to be required around the table, because these talks are going to involve difficult situations. They're going to involve scenarios where there's going to be deadlock, and it's going to take leaders who ultimately make the decision on behalf of their organizations to achieve that compromise. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing from these parties and the leaders who've been present is that there's a willingness to make this work, and there's an understanding that we've got to make it work for this election.
Some of the parties, at least one or two of them, have a history of working with the ANC. So the National Freedom Party, for example, was in national government with the ANC. And sometimes in councils in KwaZulu-Natal has been working with the ANC, sometimes not, but generally. So can they attend the National Convention and be in a coalition in a council with the ANC?
I think this is going to have to be part of the discussion at the convention. I think certainly our point of view is not to make this exclusive and not to make it the kind of thing where political parties are not invited and welcome to the table. I think when they're at the table, we need to have a very real conversation, and not just with them. There are political parties that we've been in coalition with that have spoken about the possibility of coalition with the ANC. And we're going to need to have those conversations because from our point of view, we want to find ourselves with a group of parties that are building an alternative to the ANC. And you're not going to do that in coalition with the ANC.
So one of the things that you are going to have to do is to, if this were all to work according to the plan as you've laid out, is you have to convince people that a group of different opposition parties who've worked together in local government but never in national government before, some of them you've never worked with before, that they will be a more stable, a more stable option than the ANC, which is one party, or even an ANC-EFF coalition, which would just be two parties. Isn't that quite a difficult sell? Vote for us, we'll be more stable than the one party.
Well, I don't think so, because, I mean, you've got to ask yourself stability for what purpose? So if you have one or two parties that produce on a theoretical level greater stability, but they are using that stability to loot the state, to bring in cadre deployment, to corrupt state-owned entities and to capture the civil service, what kind of stability are we talking about? I think the challenge undoubtedly is that more political parties, that process needs to be managed. And already I think there's a conversation taking place among this group of parties to say, if we're going to talk coalitions purely at a position level, we're never going to achieve stability. We have to talk about genuine power sharing and a joint manifesto that is implemented by all of us.
It's quite ambitious to think you'll get more votes than the ANC and the EFF together, because that's really what you'd have to do on the way that this has been described.
Well, I don't think so. So even if you look at the electoral trends in South Africa, the ANC is in sharp decline. Even the EFF has started to stagnate and decline. And I think the most important market of South Africans that people are not paying attention to are the people who've given up on the political system. So we had 46% voter turnout in the last election. There's another 14 million South Africans who are unregistered to vote, 26 million people who didn't vote in the last elections. We need to talk to those people, because if we give those people a reason to believe that it's not just that the ANC is falling apart, but there is a coherent alternative, I think they're going to come out in numbers.
So there are certain things which are going to be relatively easy for opposition parties to agree on. For example, fixing load shedding, obvious. Better services, well, everyone says that, but yes. But some issues might be a little more complicated. For example, what happens if someone is accused of a crime? What happens if someone is charged of a crime? Are you going to try and sort of tackle those things at the National Convention, or are you going to use this as talks about maybe negotiations?
No, they're definitely going to be tackled at the National Convention, and there's a reason why. On a theoretical level, all political parties in South Africa are against corruption. Even the ANC say they're against corruption. So you've got to go to a further level of detail beyond that and really examine what parties are willing to do in the real-life situations that face you in government. Because government isn't an academic environment. It's a very practical world where you've got to respond to real-life situations. And I think that's the process that we've started with these parties. It absolutely has to be a cornerstone of the convention, and it has to be the centerpiece of a document that will become a pact and made public to the South African people.
There's an awful lot that's going to happen between now and probably August next year, which I imagine is when the elections will be, or somewhere around that. So what you have to try and do is get a group of South African leaders who represent very different constituencies to work together more closely than they ever have against the one political party in this country's history that has actually been able to unite people across colour, across race, across language, across the different regions and provinces of South Africa. I mean, I appreciate the ambition. I like political ambition. But it's an ambitious thing you're trying to do.
It certainly is. And I think, let's be clear, it's been a very long time since the ANC has sought to unite any of those groups that you're referring to now. But I think what we're doing is ambitious, and let's be real, South Africa is in very serious trouble. And it's going to have to take serious ambition and serious leadership from a group of political parties to get us out of that mess and to start the turnaround of our country. And it's not going to be done by the meek and the mild. It's going to be done by those people who take the proverbial bull by the horns and provide the leadership that this country has been desperately waiting for.
There are a couple of other political parties who have been working with the ANC or been seeming to. The ATM is one of them. Cope sort of worked with you and then now works with them. The Patriotic Alliance are pretty much the same, although sometimes a bit complicated to explain what they're doing. Is the door still open for a political party like the ATM, for example, or would you prefer to keep them out?
I think the door must be open to all political parties. I think the real test when people try and enter the door must be a values test. Are political parties aligned to the values of constitutionalism, and do they share common ground on how to address those greatest challenges I was talking about that the South African people experience? If there's alignment, we must talk. If there isn't alignment, then I think, frankly, there's no point in even having those discussions. I think the one important thing that we want to see is that the baggage of the recent and ancient past shouldn't be used to poison the national project. We should have an open mind, and we should go into this willing to bring parties from one side of the aisle across to ours, because ultimately that's the only way this thing will achieve the stated objective of building a majority.
Michael Beaumont, thank you. National Chair of Action SA.